Welcome to week 5 of EPM 4355, ISO 14001 standards for environmental management systems. This week we're going to talk about resources, competence, awareness, and communication. So we begin with our plan, do, check, act diagram. We see that we have covered everything up to the point of doing, which is implementing, which in the terms of the standard are support and operation, clauses 7 and 8 and all the subclauses associated with them. This is a pretty big part of the standard. We're going to spend 3 weeks in this area because it's central to the operation of the EMS and the integration into business processes. This week we're going to cover 2 basic areas, the resources and competence. We'll go over key definitions and the roles of resources and competence, and review the requirements for them, and then how we need to document competence. Then we're going to talk a little bit about awareness and communication. We will review some key definitions, explain some of the roles of awareness and communication in an organization and within an EMS, and then review the 14001 awareness and communication requirements. So, what are we really concerned with when we talk about resources? Well, resources are the multiple forms of capital that an organization needs to operate. Human resources, people, natural resources, raw materials, ecosystems, that kind of a thing. Air, water, sunlight. The infrastructure of the organization, its capital equipment, buildings, offices, that kind of thing. The specific technology that an organization is using, and the financial resources, the money needed to create economic value flows throughout the organization. Human resources include specialized skills and knowledge. This is important because this forms what is known as a competitive advantage that can't be duplicated. And some infrastructure resources related to environmental management would include the organization's buildings, equipment, underground tanks, and drainage system. So when we talk about competence, it's important that we understand what we mean. And competence is something that you're going to demonstrate in your final project for the class, because you'll produce an example of an analysis so that you demonstrate that you're competent to produce this within an EMS in the future. Competence is simply the ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. So it's a little bit more, in most cases, it's the demonstrated ability to apply knowledge and skills. How do you determine competence? By demonstrating your ability and achieving intended results. Resources in an EMS are what enable it to function. In many cases, especially true with the 2004 version of the standard, inadequate resources were frequently a root cause of system effectiveness or a lack of efficiency. When you have a middle management tool set, it tends not to be related to the core of the organization's business and the core of the organization's value proposition. But with 2015, that has shifted. There are multiple links to the organization's core business, and it's between the core business and its EMS. And so one of the areas that you can look towards in an EMS, if things aren't working properly, is, first of all, are there adequate resources to make this happen? Are you struggling with an out-of-date information system, or is the equipment several models behind the latest models and very inefficient? Are people that are working there, are they not being paid enough, and are you not attracting the people with the relative competence that you need? So resources and competence are closely related. Top management's accountable for making sure the EMS has sufficient resources to implement the policy and to achieve the defined objectives. And in many cases, as I'm sure you're aware, internal resources can be supplemented by an external provider. This is known as outsourcing, especially for specialized services like regulatory compliance, determination, and assessment. These may be outsourced. Some actual functions of the organization, operations, may be outsourced. And so the resources, whether they're internal or externally supplemented, all need to meet certain criteria because they have to be sufficient for the EMS to function. Competence is the application of knowledge, skills, and abilities to resources. So competence ensures the EMS will operate properly by making sure that, first of all, people have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities, and then supporting these people, especially the people who are functioning within an EMS within certain contexts. And so within an EMS, the context is that people whose work has the potential to cause a significant environmental impact, and those individuals who are assigned responsibilities for environmental management systems shall be competent. And that includes people who determine and evaluate environmental impacts or compliance obligations, people who contribute to the achievement of an environmental objective, those who respond to emergency situations, and those who perform internal audits and evaluations of compliance. When you are gaining competence or need competence, you can use training, because training fills the gaps between what employees know and what they need to know, and what they can do and what they need to do. So training is something that, when you look at competence, is something that can solve situations where the competence is not quite sufficient in order for the EMS to operate properly. So there are certain requirements for resources and competence. First of all, the organization shall determine and provide the resources needed. Again, this is a responsibility of top management, of leadership, executive management, to make sure that the resources that are available are sufficient for implementing, maintaining, and continually improving the EMS. And so there's two parts of this. Someone has to determine what's needed, and then also actually provide what's needed. So one of the areas that we see weaknesses here is that the determinations are not made on a routine basis, and so they can fall behind. In terms of competence, there's a couple of very important requirements. Again, we have a shall statement. So the first requirement is that the organization has to determine what's necessary in terms of the EMS operations. What are the competencies of people doing work that affect environmental performance and affect the organization's ability to fulfill its compliance obligations? So we have to determine these. Then we have to ensure that these people, once we've determined these competence levels for specific people, to ensure these people are competent. And then how do we do that? Through education, training, or experience. And then if they are not, then we can determine training needs that might be associated with any lack of competence or with additional competencies due to environmental aspects and the EMS. And then take actions to acquire it, which is in most cases provide training, and then evaluate the effectiveness of that training. This is interesting because it's not necessarily just to provide training. We have to evaluate the effectiveness of that training. So yes, you can train people, but if they sleep through the classes, you are not getting a lot, and you have not really demonstrated that people have increased their competencies. But an EMS requires that you look at the effectiveness of that training, and through a demonstrated competency, like a final exam or something that holds the people's feet to the fire, where they have to really show that they know something or they can do something. And so applicable actions can include, provision of training, or mentoring, or reassignment of currently people, or hiring or contracting of competent persons. So this is really an HR function, but the EMS requirements are very clear, and that people who function within the EMS must be competent. They must be able to do what their roles and responsibilities say they have to do, and they have to be able to demonstrate that, and the demonstration has to be documented as evidence of competence. So it's a pretty strong set of requirements. People who are working within the EMS need to be able to show that they know what they're doing. They have the requisite uh, competencies to fulfill their particular role in the EMS. Now, here's a nice way to document competence, a very simple training plan. You have, again, an operation or an aspect which we tie back to. The procedures that are used, person responsible, the training needs, how these needs are accomplished, when, and the length of them, the budget as necessary, and a completion date, and then the person responsible for training. You could do this outsourcing, and then you would update your training records, the training plan, when it's completed. So this is one way of documenting competence. Another way is by individual. You can have an individual training record. Many organizations use this. This is not quite as powerful because it's not really tied back into a specific process. But you could add a column, training attended, training location, and your notes just required for process operator such and such. So, and this is the type of training. This is where you might link it back to aspects or processes. The award CEU certification are where you would link it back to the demonstration of competency at completion of training. So awareness now, once we have adequate resources that are, and the human resources, the people that are involved in the EMS are competent to perform their operations. Awareness is something that applies to all people who have functions within the EMS and all those who are affected by functions within the EMS. So this means that part of competency is the ability to demonstrate awareness. Again, the guidance is that people don't have to memorize the environmental policy, or they don't have to have a copy of it that they take out of their pocket and show. But they need to be aware that it exists and what their purpose and role is in achieving the policy commitments, and including how their work can affect the organization's ability to fulfill its compliance obligations. So awareness is an important part of training and mentoring, and so that the folks who have direct functions within an EMS need to be aware of their purpose and their role. And even those who are affected by the EMS operations within the organization, those who are contributing to solid waste, or perhaps those you wouldn't even think that would be involved, such as the people in the accounting department, they need to be aware of the policy's existence and how they can help to achieve the environmental policy. Maybe just a simple thing like recycling their paper, or choosing to purchase recycled paper, something like this. But awareness needs to be distributed throughout the organization. So if you have an EMS, that's a core part of your business, the scope is the entire business. That means that anyone who has any form of environmental impact, or their job has an environmental aspect that results in an impact, needs to be aware of the policy and their purpose and their role in achieving the commitments, as well as their purpose and their role in achieving and fulfilling the compliance obligations. Now, communication is one way that organizations can beyond formal training programs. For lesser items where specific competencies aren't required and just more of an informative type of a thing. For example, individuals who have indirect influence on the EMS can simply take part in the communication processes, and these can be formal or informal. However, the processes themselves will need to be documented. And when you have communication occurring in an organization, it really acts as a lubricant. It helps things to move better because people know what to do. It allows the organization to provide and obtain information relevant to its EMS for continual improvement. Again, communication is a two-way process, both between people and in and out of the organization. And so until that loop is completed, the communication has not occurred. People have to acknowledge that they understand the meaning of the messages. And this includes, in organizations, a defined process for complaint handling. Because again, we go back to the organizational contexts. Complaint handling is a process for detecting improvement opportunities as well as risks that could impact the EMS. And communications within the organization should, first of all, they should fulfill these criteria. Should be transparent. The organization is open in the way it derives what it's reported on. And be appropriate so that it meets the needs of relevant interested parties, enabling them to participate. You don't want to send a 200-page technical report out to the local the Women's Knitting Society because they're probably not going to be able to make sense out of it, but you might want to produce a generalized report or something that's summarized for these folks so they can understand the basic environmental aspects and impacts of what's going on within the organization. They don't need to know the concentrations of sulfur dioxide in multiple points of emissions, but they need to know overall what's being done in terms of management. Be truthful and not misleading. Again, this means that the information is verifiable, factual, accurate, able to be trusted. Not exclude relevant information. So in other words, sources of the EMS that may not be functioning properly need to be included. And then be understandable. This goes back to being at the appropriate level of technical detail. You don't want to provide detailed technical reports to people who are non-technical in nature, and vice versa. You don't want to provide general reports to people who need technical information. And so the requirements are for awareness. We go back to awareness that the organization shall ensure that persons doing work under the organization's control are aware of a couple of four different things, four different components here. They have to be aware of the environmental policy. They have to be aware of the significant environmental aspects and their actual or potential impacts associated with their work. They can't just be working blind or working in a box. They have to understand how their work affects the environment, both internally and then with the interactive environment, the influential environment, and then the environment as a whole. They have to understand their contribution to the effectiveness of the EMS, including their benefits of enhanced environmental performance. What happens if they exceed their process parameters and do better than what they're required to do? And then they have to be able to demonstrate that they're aware of the implications of not conforming with the environmental management system requirements, including not fulfilling the organization's compliance obligations. So anyone within the organization, this means you can go down to the janitor or perhaps people working in departments that you would think are not directly related to environmental management. These people have to understand. They just have to be aware of that there's an environmental policy, that they are aware of the aspects and impacts associated with their work, how they contribute to the EMS, and how they can make their performance better, and then what the implications of not conforming to the EMS. What is it that is important about fulfilling the compliance obligations, and what will happen if they don't? And this means everyone. So this is again another another strength of the 2015 revision is that it extends out to everyone in the organization. For communication, there are several critical requirements. First of all, managers have to understand that what they're going to communicate. They have to establish, implement, and maintain the processes for internal and external communication. They have to decide what they're going to communicate about environmental performance, when, with whom, and how. And so these processes and the messages that are being delivered need to be defined. Again, simplicity rules here. You don't want to have dozens and dozens of different messages going out, because then you run the risk of either duplicating effort or providing incorrect information to one or more people. So when establishing its communication processes, the organization shall take into account its compliance obligations, and then make sure that the information is consistent with information generated within the EMS. It's also important, the 14,001 standard requires that the organization respond to relevant communications. Again, this could be complaint handling, or it could just be simply suggestions, or it could just be requests for information. And then the organization has to retain documented information as evidence of these processes. So it has to maintain information about the decision, what, when, who, and how the compliance obligations are included in these communication processes, how they make sure that the information is consistent and valid. Somebody must go back and check it. How the information, or how the organization is responding to relevant communication. So they have to define here what's relevant. And then all of this has to be documented. There are two forms of communication that 14,001 requires, internal and external. And so the first, internal, requires the organization to internally communicate information relevant to the EMS among various levels and functions, including changes to the EMS. And the second is the real kicker here, to ensure its communication processes enable persons doing work under the organization's control to contribute to continual improvement. How do people who are working within the organization, regardless of their function, whether they have direct responsibility for the EMS or not, how do they contribute to continual improvement of the EMS? How do they do that? How do they contribute to continual improvement of environmental performance and help achieve the objectives, perhaps reduce the impacts? How do they do that? This is really important, because again, this is one of the drivers of the EMS into the entire organization. The second is external communication. This is where we get into our open systems model. The organization shall externally communicate information relevant to the EMS, as established by the communication processes, as required by its compliance obligations. So this is regulatory reporting, plus whatever else the organization decides to communicate to whom and when. So there are two real keys here. One is that communication processes have to drive awareness of the EMS into the organization, as well as the awareness of the EMS and what it's doing externally to interested parties. So that's it for this week's lecture. Ask any questions in the instructor office threads, or send me an email, and we'll see you online.